We would like to start this webinar with a brief land acknowledgement for the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have presence and deep connection with the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine, a part of what is known to the Indigenous peoples of North America as Turtle Island. These lands are the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewas of Georgina Island, Brahma, and Beausoleil, and of the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Scugog Island, the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We would like to thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. Indigenous peoples have been subjected to colonial oppression and injustice, which continues to this day. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust acknowledges that the first step to reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous peoples and their inherent rights to the land, which will ensure that we are creating a better future by strengthening our relationship with them and the land. Our land trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by ensuring healthy ecosystems that thrive forever. We recognize that working together with Indigenous peoples to include ecological traditional knowledge systems moves us towards an equitable and sustainable future. So what is a land trust? We are a charitable organization dedicated to ecological protection. We receive land easement donations. We can either buy or receive donated land that we can own, or we can negotiate conservation easement agreements with landowners, in which the landowners still own the land, but we help them protect it, and that protection is forever, no matter how many landowners come after them. So landowners do experience tax benefits if they negotiate conservation easements with us. And all protection, whether it's a nature reserve that we own or a conservation easement agreement with a landowner, that is mandated protection. So nothing can really overrule that. It's protection beyond legislation. So currently we protect 5,269 acres, over 67 properties. A few of these properties are new as of 2022 and 2023. So all of these properties we protect across the Oak Ridges Moraine help promote climate change resiliency and protect species at-risk habitat. And we also promote biodiversity and environmental heritage by protecting all of these properties. So why do we do it? As I said before, we like protecting healthy ecosystems and species at-risk habitat, and we want future generations to be able to experience the beauty of the ecosystems we have today and all the species we have today, not just species at risk. So this is a map of the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust properties as of 2022. As of 2023, we would have a few more dots on this, but you can see that Oak Ridges Moraine is the light green, long blob of land across the green belt from Peel to Northumberland. And the yellow dots here are our conservation easement agreements. So those are landowner properties in which we help them protect their land. The red dots are our nature reserves that we own. And the one lone little purple dot is a joint ownership that we have. So you can see our properties that we help protect stretch all the way across the Oak Ridges Moraine.
I'm really excited to have so many people joining us this evening. It's always nice to see people excited about birds. And yeah, this is, as we'll see in the presentation, wintertime is strangely enough one of my favorite times to be outdoors and experiencing nature. And hopefully I can share some of that enthusiasm for you. I'm just going to share my screen here. Go into the PowerPoint. All right, are you seeing the screen? Is everything good? All right. So this is The Wonderful World of Winter Birds by May Matchim. So believe it or not, winter is one of the best times of the year to enjoy birds. So a lot of these pictures in the presentation today are from Eileen. She's a really great photographer and a very knowledgeable herder. This is a great photo of some common redpolls hanging out. Yeah, wintertime, a lot of people are hanging out indoors. They don't really want to be hanging out in natural areas and their parks and fields and places like that. But there's a lot of really fascinating wildlife. We tend to think about birds flying south for the winter, and that's true for a lot of species. And we'll explore that a little bit. Why do birds migrate? It's a question that I get asked a lot. Um, it seems like an awful lot of effort to travel all those. If we look at a bird like the bobolink here, you can see that map of how far it migrates. So they nest up in the northern US and into Canada, into the prairies in northern Ontario and out in grasslands and agricultural fields. And then they migrate thousands of kilometers all the way to the pampas of Argentina and Bolivia and places like that. And they're tiny little songbirds. So why do you think they would make such a massive migration? And then if you look at another bird that we're familiar with, the blue jay, that a lot of us know from our backyards and from city parks, they hang out here all year round. All that sort of purple area on the map there is their year-round range. So they don't really seem to move. So why would the bobolink fly so many thousands of kilometers, whereas the blue jay would choose to hang out in the same place all year? And then if we look at another bird we have here in the province, snowy owl, they only really visit us in southern Ontario in the wintertime. So if you see that sort of reddish area at the top of the map, that's where they breed. That's where they have their young. Um, and that bluey area is where they disperse and where they go in the wintertime. So why do you think a bird would come visit us only in the winter? This is an interesting comparison here. These are two close relatives, the cedar waxwing and the Bohemian waxwing. That's one of my favorite of all bird names. I love whoever came up with that. They have that name because they like to sort of wander around in these roving packs looking for berries. And one really cute thing that waxwings will do actually is sometimes you'll get a big line of them and they'll pass berries from one to another until, like maybe the 10th or 12th one in the line will finally eat it. It's really cute to see. Um, but yeah, the Bohemian waxwing, if you look at their map, they breed further north and they only come down here in the wintertime. But if you look at the map for the cedar waxwing, which might be a familiar bird for some of the people here tonight, they breed in this part of the world. And in the wintertime, they'll go further south even, see into Mexico and Central America. So why would two very similar birds with very similar diets, why would one only come here in the wintertime and why would one spend all year around here? Well, the answer largely has to do with food. So here's a picture of a robin eating a caterpillar and some caterpillars on the side of a tree there. A lot of the birds that do migrate are ones that eat things like insects, which are hard to come by in Ontario in the wintertime. So if you're something like a warbler or a flycatcher and you need to eat insects, there's not a lot of that in the GTA in January. I mean, a little bit with climate change now. So we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. But every year there's a few weird insect-eating birds that were supposed to have migrated and they don't. And bird watchers get excited because a yellow-rumped warbler will show up at their local park or what have you. But it largely has to do with something like a bobolink is flying all the way to the pampas of Argentina because there's a lot of insects down there. And birds that will hang around here tend to have a more varied diet, or they'll eat things like nuts or fruit that hangs out on trees that persists into the wintertime. They're able to exist in more difficult conditions. So I remember growing up, people would always tell me that seeing a robin was a sure sign of spring. And people ask me a lot of the time, they'll be like, I saw a robin in January, is that rare? And it's actually data from breeding bird atlases and from Christmas bird counts and things like that. It's shown that the American robin, more and more of them every year are hanging around in places like Ontario and Michigan when they used to fly south to the southern west for the winter time. And that has to do with climate change. So it's warmer for them, so there are more things that they can eat. Robins eat a lot of insects, like worms. Famously, we associate robins, eating worms on the sidewalk. They eat fruit like berries as well. And so they do have a bit of enough of a varied diet that they can survive the Ontario winter. So it's actually not that rare to see a robin in the wintertime. If you're looking for one specifically, if you go into a wooded area and you go around like a creek or a fast-flowing stream where the ice hasn't formed because of the water movement, a lot of the time that's where the insects are able to persist in the wintertime. So things like robin, other birds that were supposed to have migrated that will hang around there. It's just warm enough. A lot of birds, though, they'll hang around all year round. So here's sort of a collage showing some of the Ontario birds that will hang around here all year round. So we have raptors like red-tailed hawks, a lot of owls, including great horned owls, eastern screech owls, barred owls. They're interesting because those species will actually mate in the wintertime, which is unusual. So will mourning doves and pigeons. Mourning doves will spend the whole year round. A lot of ground birds like the ruffed grouse or the wild turkey will also hang around all winter. Hardier birds with a more varied diet, so things like northern cardinal, American goldfinches, black-capped chickadees, red and white-breasted nuthatches. Most woodpeckers will continue to hang around in Ontario in the wintertime. The two big exceptions are the northern flicker and the red-headed woodpecker. Now, all woodpeckers like to eat insects and their larvae that are in trees underneath their bark. But those two woodpeckers like to eat insects, a lot more insects that are outside of tree bark. So the northern flicker is like the one species of woodpecker in Ontario where you'll often see it on the ground, on the grass, sort of looking for ants. It's sort of a strange behavior. And then the red-headed woodpecker likes to hang out in open areas and it will perch and it'll sort of swoop over and fly over and catch insects in flight, almost like a flycatcher. So maybe you see something like an bird or a great crested flycatcher do this, where they'll be on an exposed perch and they'll fly out and they'll catch an insect. And red-headed woodpeckers like to do that. And they particularly like to do it at roadsides, which is actually terrible news for them because it's one of the reasons why they're on the endangered species list in Ontario, because it makes them vulnerable to being in the traffic, getting hit by cars. Yeah, so a lot of birds that have a more varied diet are able to exist in the wintertime and hang around all year. Now, wintertime in Ontario is fantastic for ducks. Some birders like to nickname it Weird Duck Season, which I really love. It's when duck diversity is at its greatest. A lot of these ducks that we see, we only really see in the wintertime, like long-tailed ducks, redheads, harlequin ducks get the odd one, the three species of scoter, black, white wing, and surf. And they all like to nest up in the Arctic tundra. And so they come down to Lake Ontario to hang out in the wintertime because for them, the conditions are actually a little bit nice. So when we were looking at that snowy owl earlier, and I was asking, why would some birds come here only in the wintertime? For a lot of those species, they're nesting up in the tundra or the boreal forest. So Toronto in January is balmy and inviting for them, and there's more food than they know what to do with. So this is like a true buffet for them. These ducks can be divided largely into two types. There's the dabbling ducks, things like the mallards that we're all familiar with, American black ducks, gadwalls, and they like to feed towards the surface. They like to eat a lot of vegetation. And then there's diving ducks, things like the mergansers, goders, buffleheads, which are a true favorite of mine. They're diving ducks. They like to actually dive underwater, and they eat things like mollusks, crayfish, fish. Generally, hunters don't like to eat them because they have sort of a gamey taste because of that diet. A lot of them nest up in the tundra as well. But strangely enough, the goldeneye and the bufflehead actually nest in the boreal forest in tree cavities, which is something we tend to associate with things like woodpeckers and owls, like nesting in holes in trees. But if you can believe it, there's several species of ducks that do this. Yeah, so if you're ever up in the boreal forest, keep your eyes open for little duck babies peeking their heads out. So here are three of the most common winter visitors that we get here in Southern Ontario. A lot of you will be familiar with these. The dark-eyed junco is pretty ubiquitous this time of year. It's a small gray sparrow, sometimes nicknamed the snowbird, just like the song from the 1970s that we all know and love. The white-throated sparrow, known for its call, which sounds like "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada," or "Oh, Sam Peabody, Peabody, Peabody," depending on whether you're reading an American or Canadian Field Guide. The American tree sparrow is nice as well. It has a really sort of conspicuous spot on its breast and a nice rusty red sort of cap, and they like to hang around in the wintertime. All three of these birds like places like old fields, weedy areas, disused lots, hedgerows, but they'll all come to backyard feeders. One of my opinions that I'm always happy to share with people is that best thing you can have at your backyard feeder is either black oil sunflower seed, because that's a true crowd pleaser. Like the most diversity of birds will come to your backyard feeder if you have that, but also Niger. They're a little bit more expensive, but a lot of those sort of like mixed bird seeds that you get at places like Costco in the big bags have a lot of things like millet that are fillers that the birds don't actually really like. So they'll go after the sunflower seeds and the peanuts and things like that, and then they're kind of disgusted by the millet. So if you really love your backyard birds, you'll treat them right. Get them back black oil sunflower seed and Niger. So another really interesting aspect of winter birding in Ontario are eruption. When you hear the word eruption, it's spelled a little bit differently, but you think of like volcanoes. And it's kind of a similar process, things moving very rapidly and unexpectedly forth. So there are some species which have a history of erupting, which is when they move from one part of their range where they typically occur into another part of their range where they occur less frequently. So a lot of these species from the boreal forest, and a few of them from up in the Arctic tundra, like the snowy owl, or a lot of finches, like this red crossbill and that pine siskin, they are eruptive species. And typically, the reason why these birds will move south has to do with the availability of food. It can be hard to predict which years they'll move south. Usually, there's at least one species every winter in Ontario that tends to erupt, show up in good numbers. I was at Algonquin Park on Sunday, and there was hundreds of red crossbills and pine siskins. If you've never seen either of those finches before, they're both super gorgeous birds. Take the drive up to Algonquin. They're hanging out on the roads, eating the sand that they put out for ice. They use the grit in the sand to help them digest the food they eat. We'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, it's definitely, they've erupted southwards this year. I've been to Algonquin other winters and seen no crossbills. So I was delighted to see so many of them. As I said, a lot of the time it has to do with the availability of food. But it can also follow complicated boom and bust population cycles, typically with a prey species. So the traditional understanding of why snowy owls erupt southward, it's tied to populations of lemmings. Those are the little rodents out on the tundra that they like to eat. And every few years, the lemming population will just explode. And lemmings have evolved this way, so every few years there'll be more lemmings than all the Arctic foxes and all the falcons, all the snowy owls can eat, and that allows them to continue to survive and multiply. But for the owls, that's an amazing year because there's so many lemmings available to eat, their favorite food. And it means that more of their young will survive. But the next year, when there's not nearly as many lemmings born, it's a huge crisis for the snowy owls. And they say, oh God, what do we do? And that's when they all fly south. And that's when you see them in a farmer's field in Whitby. So every few years, birders get very excited as all the snowy owls are hungry and turn up in southern Ontario. It's interesting. A few decades ago, somebody named Ron Pittaway, who was a really incredibly knowledgeable and generous Ontario birder, who unfortunately we lost a few months ago, but he's actually broke down all the data of what these winter finches like to eat and where the crops of those species were good in different parts of the boreal forest and across North America. And using that data and using observations from places like Tadoussac in Quebec along the St. Lawrence, where a lot of birds move through on a migratory pathway, and taking the reports from different naturalists across the continent, he was able to predict when finches would erupt and when they would show up southwards. And it was a remarkably accurate model. Nowadays, somebody named Tyler Hoare has taken up the reins and still does the winter finch forecast. So I think it's in September it comes out, and all the birders are kind of anxiously waiting to see if they're going to get evening grosbeak or red poles this year. Every species has like slight differences which foods they prefer to eat. So if it's a really good year for alder up north, all the common redpolls will probably stay up north. They're not going to fly south. But if there's not a lot of maple keys or alder one winter, that means that they might show up in Toronto and fly down to our part of the world. So we're going to get into the winter finches. Winter finches are probably my favorite group of the winter birds we get here in Southern Ontario. They're so beautiful, and there's something like so charismatic about them, particularly that unpredictability and the fact that they kind of rove around the continent, moving wherever they feel like, wherever food's available. The pine grosbeak, which we see on the left, or sorry, on the right of my screen, is a species that's found throughout Europe and Asia, as well as North America. They're a boreal species. They're way up, like north of Supermarine, north of Thunder Bay, that primarily coniferous forest up there. The evening grosbeak only occurs in North America. And up until about 150 years ago, we didn't really have them in Eastern North America. The late 19th century, they started to expand eastwards. And then by the 1920s, they were breeding in New England and started to show up in Ontario. So they've only really been with us for about 100 years in this part of the world. It's an interesting range expansion. It might have to do with the planting of Manitoba maples, or sometimes called box elders, as an ornamental tree or in shelter belts by farmers, because that's a favorite food of theirs, the keys of the Manitoba maple. So that might have allowed them to expand eastwards. But interestingly, the evening grosbeak is experiencing one of the sharpest population declines of any songbird in Ontario. They're on the species at risk list, but a lot of it probably has to do with their favorite food in the summertime, which is a kind of moth called spruce budworm. And in the forestry industry, they spray glyphosate and all sorts of other nasty chemical insecticides to try to control it to make the forest, as productive as possible for lumbering. But it means that birds like the evening grosbeak and our two cuckoo species, which like to eat caterpillars, unfortunately are experiencing pretty sharp population declines. If you go to Algonquin Park anytime in the winter, you're likely to get flocks of them at the visitor center, the evening grosbeaks, they have a bunch of feeders that they put up behind there. This year, there's not as many around because it was a good year for a lot of the crops that they like to eat up in Northern Ontario. They like to eat things like seeds from maple, ash, cherry, elm, pine, as well as small fruit, berries, and some insects as well. Pine grosbeaks are a little bit more unpredictable. You have to kind of look and find areas with trees that have the kind of food that they like to eat, as well as paying attention to reports, what birds are in your area, winter finch forecast, and things like that. The next two are two of my favorites: the red crossbill and the white-winged crossbill. These are two species that are found throughout North America as well as Europe and Asia. And the red crossbill is really fascinating because it provides a great example of why the concept of the species is kind of arbitrary and limited and designed by humans for convenience. All across their range, there's different what's known as call types of the red crossbill. Now, usually scientists talk about species and then subspecies, and subspecies are a very particular looking and behaving group of a particular species, which is restricted to a geographic area. So for instance, there's a Newfoundland red crossbill that only lives in Newfoundland. That's a subspecies. But the call types aren't quite a species, aren't quite a subspecies. They're kind of their own thing. It's very confusing for scientists to know exactly how to feel about it or how to categorize them. Each call type has its own call, as the word suggests. They only breed with each other. They don't interbreed with other call types, and they have preferences. So a lot of them in their name of the call type, it'll tell you exactly what it is. There's like a Sitka spruce call type. I recorded red crossbills up on Opiongo Road at Algonquin Park this past Sunday calling, and I sent them to an organization called the Finch Research Network, the level of like bird nerd that I'm on. And they analyzed the call and they told me that it's a type 4, which is the Douglas fir red crossbill. So those ones are actually very rare in Ontario. They live primarily out west where they eat the cones of the Douglas fir. The reason why they're called crossbills is really fascinating too. If you look in the pictures, you can kind of see it. They're one of the only birds that has an asymmetrical bill. So the top and the bottom of their bill, they cross over like this, and that's how they get their name. And why do you think they have these crossed bills like this? That seems bizarre. It's actually so that they can put their bills inside of cones of coniferous trees, so things like hemlock, pines, spruces, and they're able to use it to open the scales and pull out the seeds inside. So they can pull out the pine nuts from a pine cone. And each of the red crossbill call types, and in North America, there's 10 different ones, it specializes in a different cone or a few different cones. Now, there's a few that are more generalist than others. But like the type 7 is more of a generalist. But the type 10, for instance, specializes in Sitka spruce. That's a species that west. It's really fascinating. Their call kind of sounds like chip, 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 chip. They fly overhead in these big flocks. The white-winged crossbill is closely related. It's also found in Europe and Asia as well as North America. Their call is a little bit different. And they also like to eat cones. Another interesting thing about crossbills is they can breed any time of the year. They're one of the few Ontario bird species, like we were talking about owls earlier, as well as doves and pigeons, that can nest in the wintertime. As long as they're in appropriate habitat, they can nest in like the middle of January. They're amazing, hardy little birds that travel east and west, north and south, like all over the continent, roving around looking for food, depending upon the availability of the crops of cone. Now, red poles. Red poles are another favorite of mine. They're absolutely beautiful. Pole is like an old English word meaning head. And so their name basically means red head. There's also a warbler called a black pole warbler, so a black head warbler. And tadpole, like a baby frog, actually comes from the Old English. It means toad head, so toad pole. So there's your etymology trivia for the day. Red poles have the red dot on their head. And there's currently two species in Canada. It's extremely contentious because the common red pole and the hoary red pole are very, very similar. A lot of the time in the field, you can't tell them apart. I remember a few years ago, there was a big eruption of red poles. I think this was the first winter of COVID, 2021. Nobody knows how to keep track of time because of the pandemic. But anyway, there was red poles everywhere. And I spent hundreds of hours, literally, trying to find hoary red poles in flocks of common red poles out in places like Tommy Thompson Park and Downsview Park in Toronto. The hoary red pole, like its name suggests, like hoarfrost, like it's sort of frostier, whiter looking. They have unmarked or largely unmarked undertails, the little like bum area underneath the back of the tail. They have less streaking on their breast than their sides and on the flanks. There's some minor differences in like the shape of the cone of the beak and the size and things like that. But a lot of the time you really can't tell them apart, especially if there's a flock of 143 red poles and they're all moving from tree to tree, eating alder cones or maple keys. How do you find that one that's a little bit paler? And at what point are you confident enough to say, oh, that's definitely a hoary red pole versus that's a common red pole that's a little bit paler? Recently, there was a genetic study on them because it's such a taxonomic debate. This is another good example of why the idea of a species kind of arbitrary and silly doesn't really reflect the diversity of nature. There's been a debate with scientists about whether they're two different species or the same. A few years ago, there was a proposal of the American Ornithological Society to lump them together into one species, but it failed. But there was a study on their genetics, and they found that they were 99.99% identical genetically, which is more genetically identical than many bird subspecies. And it's roughly equal to the difference between a human with freckles or without freckles, or a human with red hair versus a human with black hair. So some scientists suggest that it's probably best to understand them as it's basically outward expressions of different genes being turned on and off in what is roughly the same bird. It's kind of some are more on the sliding scale of common redpoll, and some are more on the sliding scale of hoary redpoll. Common redpoll is far more common in southern Ontario in wintertime eruptions. The hoary is up in the Arctic, where that paler color helps them blend in. So these are two other winter finches. As I mentioned earlier, there's hundreds and hundreds of pine siskins at Algonquin right now. There's a lot of purple finches as well. You might be familiar with the house finches that you see in the backyard sometimes coming to the bird feeder. The males have a really bright red head. Roger Torrey Peterson, the naturalist birder, once described the purple finch as a finch that was dipped in raspberry juice, which I've always loved as a description of the color there. The house finches are actually native to the Western U.S. They were introduced in Eastern North America in the early 20th century. Allegedly, they were illegally kept cage birds that were released on Staten Island about the 1930s. And by the 70s and 80s, they were showing up in South Central Ontario, in places like Truro and the Kawarthas. So they're actually more common in a lot of places in Southern Ontario than the purple finch, despite the purple finch being native. Yeah, they both these species though will come to your backyard feeder during eruption years. Yeah, both super cool birds. These are some other interesting ones. These are open country predators. So the ruffed-legged hawk, the northern harrier, and then the northern shrike. So these are birds that like open countries. They like places like grasslands, agricultural fields. Locally, the area right around the Holland Marsh between Highway 400 and Peel, as well as Cottageville Swamp, area by Schomburg, Cawthron Mullock Nature Preserve, fields out by Everett, Ontario, out by the gravel pit in particular. They're all good places to see these birds, but they can turn up in just about any agricultural field. The rough-legged hawk breeds up in the Arctic tundra. It's one of the largest hawks in North America in the Buteo genus, which is the genus that's familiar species like the red-tailed hawk. They're truly massive, impressive birds. Really good place to see the northern harrier and the rough-legged hawk in the wintertime are Amherst and Wolfe Island out by Kingston. It's a really fun little ferry ride out there. And if you drive around and look in these fields, you see a lot of these great open country raptors. The northern shrike is another boreal species that comes down here in the wintertime. It's really interesting because shrikes are the carnivorous songbirds we have here in Ontario. So they'll actually eat things like mice and even smaller birds. They have these really thick, sort of hooked bills. We have two species in the province, the loggerhead shrike, which is super endangered. You can only really find in two spots in the province. Cardinalvar out in the Kawartha Lakes, and then Napanee Limestone Plain out by Napanee, Lennox, and Addington. It's a grassland species that's been really badly impacted by habitat loss. And they really depend on conservation work and captive breeding. And there's a really talented naturalist named Hazel Wheeler who's in charge of the breeding program but the northern shrikes come down from the boreal forest, and you find a lot of the time in farmers' fields out on snags, like dead trees, or out on exposed branches, because they're always sort of surveying and looking around. They're trying to find a mouse or a vole that they can go after. So they have this sort of black bandit, which is quite distinctive. It's their personality. The loggerhead shrikes are known for taking their prey and impaling them after they've already killed them on things like hawthorn, thorn, locust trees. It's sort of a way to keep them saved for later, almost like a pantry. They're sometimes nicknamed the butcher bird for that reason. They'll use things like barbed wire as well. Quite grisly. These are some more open country birds. The horned lark, the snow bunting, which is one of my absolute favorite birds. I think snow buntings are so adorable. They have this gorgeous, like sort of brown, orange, like toasted marshmallow color in their non-breeding plumage when they come visit us in the wintertime. And the Lapland longspur. So these can all be seen locally in the fields north of Beaton between 27 and Tottenham Road. There's some sod farms out there, and they like to hang out in the wintertime in those fields. You can also find them around Holland Marsh. Um, there's usually smaller numbers of Lapland longspurs tucked into flocks of snow buntings. You can see big flocks, hundreds and hundreds of snow bunting. This Amherst Island and Wolf Island out in Lennox and Addington are also great places to see birds. Horned larks are found throughout the Old World as well, throughout Europe and Asia as well as North America. They're a very widely distributed bird. And then this slide is sort of a few boreal specialties. So these are birds that you're not normally going to see in Southern Ontario. But if you take a day trip to Algonquin, these are sort of the 4 target birds. I know in Mike Burrell's book, The Best Places to Bird in Ontario, wrote with his brother Kenneth, they talk about the Algonquin Grand Slam, which is when you get all 4 of these birds in one day. Nowadays, it's very difficult to do that because the boreal chickadee used to be found reliably like 15, 12 years ago along the Highway 60 corridor, Algonquin Park. But because of climate change, their range has actually shifted a little bit further north, and they're very, very hard to find in Algonquin Park. They used to be there in good numbers like every year, but now sometimes there'll be a winter where there's like 1 around in the Highway 60 corridor. They're very hard to track down. Canada jays as well, their populations are moving further and further north with climate change. So they've gotten harder to find in Algonquin Park. There's been a really interesting like long-term study into the Canada jays there along the Highway 60 corridor. So they're all banded. And, ornithologists know all the individual Canada jays and their whole life histories and everything. Canada jays like to store nuts and things like that in their food inside trees. They cache them to eat them for later, but they depend on it to be cold enough that they freeze, or else their food will spoil. And so, as temperatures rise, they're pushed further and further northwards. The black-backed woodpecker is another boreal species. You can find these on the Logging Museum Trail at Algonquin Park. Sometimes you get them on the Spruce Bog Boardwalk. I was there last Sunday, like I mentioned, and usually you can find Canada jays within the first sort of 100 meters of the Spruce Bog Boardwalk, like right when you start out. A lot of the time they're hanging right out in the parking lot because they're so eatable and they like to eat like peanuts out of people's hands. But this was the first time I ever went and I didn't see any. Canada jays, sometimes they're in the parking lot at the visitor center too. You can find them at the end of Yopiongo Road at the little parking lot there. The spruce grouse, an interesting bird, sort of outwardly similar to the ruffed grouse. These birds can subsist on spruce needles in the wintertime, and that's one of the ways that they're able to survive in habitats like spruce bogs, which are pretty barren and desolate. Spruce Bog Boardwalk in Algonquin is where most people in Ontario and a lot of North American birders, in fact, see their first spruce grouse, where I saw mine. One thing that's really cool about spruce is that it has vitamin C in the needles. When European colonizers first came to what we now call Canada, a lot of them suffered from scurvy in the wintertime because they had vitamin C, have fresh produce. And Indigenous people helped them out by introducing them to spruce tea and cedar tea, which was drinking in the wintertime because it had vitamin C to help you survive. All 4 of these birds are boreal, so they're not normally found as far south as Algonquin Park. Because Algonquin Park is in a highland region, so it's elevated, it's a little bit colder wintertime, and so that's why one of the reasons why they're able to extend to the very, very southern tip of their ranges and be found in the park there. 20 years ago, you'd be able to go to somewhere like Petroglyphs Provincial Park outside of Peterborough and see Canada jays and boreal chickadees. But now they're pretty much completely absent from the park. They've been doing Petroglyphs Christmas bird count since at least the 80s, and they used to get both species every year reliably, but it's been a very long time since they've gotten them there. So it's interesting as a birder to sometimes witness the effects of climate change in real time, because within my lifetime, the boreal chickadee has been largely pushed out of Algonquin. So Some of the most popular birds of all time, some of the most popular winter birds we have in Ontario are owls. They're also very contentious because there's a lot of ethical issues surrounding the viewing and photographing of owls. Um, I love owls. You can see my entire wall of my apartment is covered in macrame owls from 1974. I'm a huge owl fan, but it's complicated. And birders, rightfully, a lot of the time are very reluctant to share owl locations. But it's difficult when you're starting out because nobody wants to share that information with you. And we'll get into it a little bit, but these two species here you can find in open country, like agricultural fields. The short-eared owl is associated with grasslands like prairies. It's again experienced big population declines in Ontario because of the loss of that kind of habitat. The snowy owl, like we mentioned before, will come down here in the wintertime, up from the Arctic tundra, particularly in years where there's not a lot of short-eared owls like to fly low over the field, sort of look for voles. They're vole specialists. They look a little bit similar to a northern harrier, because harriers have this sort of compressed, flat face like an owl, but harriers have a long tail with like a white patch at the rump, and are a little bit different in color. Short-eared owls have this really dramatic, like eye makeup, mascara thing sort of going on. These two owls like to roost in conifers, northern saw-whet owls and long-eared owls. So they'll hang out, on branches or close to the trunk. They like to roost during the day, and they do this so that things like blue jays and chickadees and crows won't harass them. So they are very well camouflaged, and they like to hide in like cedars and spruces. These are a few rare northern visitors from up in the boreal forest. So the great gray owl, the northern hawk owl, which is sort of a sore spot for people from Schaumburg and the surrounding area. There was one in that winter of 2020, 2019, right when the pandemic started, that was hanging around in Schaumburg. And fortunately, the word got out wide and far, and it was harassed by a lot of photographers and birders. I went to see it myself, and I know a lot of people that did, but unfortunately, a lot of people didn't respect that bird or keep a respectful distance from it. Boreal owl is famously a very hard bird to see. As their name suggests, they live up in the boreal forest. And all three of these species will erupt southwards sometimes, but they're very challenging to track down. And a lot of it also has to do with people being reluctant, rightfully so, to share locations of them. So there are a lot of ethical considerations when you're going to see owls, take their picture. Owls are extremely sensitive to disturbance. Most owls are nocturnal, which means they're active during the day. Sorry, they sleep during the day and they're active at night. So that means they need to sleep every night or every day, sorry, and successfully hunt every night to survive. So if somebody spends like all day like photographing them and like taking like 300 identical photos with a giant telephoto lens, and, like waking this bird up, and they don't sleep properly, and then they're not well rested. And it's like, have you ever tried to like drive around, or drive home from work when you haven't slept? They can't hunt and they can't survive. Owls in Ontario have actually died in the past few years. There's several cases in the GTA after being harassed by wildlife. Photographers just taking picture after picture and getting too close to them. And owls have been admitted to Toronto Wildlife Center and places like that, and emaciated because they're not able to hunt at night because people are harassing them so much. And then rarer species, like I mentioned, things like boreal hawk and great gray are particularly targeted. If you know where one of those birds are, it's a hot commodity. So there are some best practices. Like I mentioned, don't share the location. Don't put it on the internet. Don't tell people, wide and far where you saw this owl. It's tricky because you do want, like your close friends, birders you respect and, know to be trustworthy, comfortable telling them. But if they tell one person and then that person tells one other person and they put it on, eBird or iNaturalist, then suddenly you have 120 people going to harass this screech owl all day, and nobody wants that. It's also good to be able to know the bird's body language. So if you're photographing an owl during the day, most of the time that owl should be asleep. If it's looking right at you, that means that it's awake, and it shouldn't be most of the time. There's also different signs of stress that owls will show. Sometimes the um, screech owls will sort of elongate their body like a branch. I think long-eared owls do that as well. But yeah, just keep track of those things. Like, it's the owl like moving? Is it looking nervous? Is it looking right at you? Distance is important. It's important to keep a big distance from these birds. The closer you get, the more likely you are to flush them. Um, Using something like a telephoto lens or binoculars or a scope, like making sure that you're far enough back. Um, and time as well. Like, don't spend all day there. Like, I have no idea how many, like, hundreds and hundreds of billions of identical photos of great horned owls that look exactly like this picture exist in the world. It's like, you really don't need to stand there and take 300 identical photos with your DSLR, most of which you'll never ever look at. Just look at the owl, spend a few seconds there, enjoy the intangible experience of being in the presence of such a glorious animal, and then be on your way. Playback, another big taboo. Don't play owl calls to try to attract them. Sometimes people will do this to try to attract songbirds too, because it'll stress them out. Things like chickadees, and it'll make them fly in just like an owl. Like I mentioned earlier, with those owls like the screech owl um, that roost in trees, or the saw-whet owl that roosts on branches and conifers. They're trying to camouflage and hide because in the middle of the day, a bunch of chickadees or blue jays or crows might find them there and freak out. And it's something called mobbing behavior. And all these songbirds will start harassing them and chasing them, and sometimes will even sort of like peck at them and pull at their feathers and trying to get the owl to move out of there, because they recognize it as a predator, even though it's sleeping and not hunting during the day. So draw attention to that owl by playing calls. Maybe it'll bring in a bunch of chickadees, it'll scare it and off, and that's extra energy. Kind of goes without saying, but don't bring lights or like bounce boards or like photography equipment. Never point a flashlight at an owl. I know there's a story from the Okanagan Valley where location of a flammulated owl was leaked, and people literally showed up with like studio lights like around this one tree in this park in Kelowna, so they could get shots of the owl like perfectly lit. Like, it's like, what do you do at that point? And then the biggest thing you never want to do is to flush or bait an owl. So every once in a while, everybody accidentally scares a bird and makes it fly off. Um, doesn't mean you're an evil person. But like we mentioned, body language before, distance, time. If you're taking all those things into consideration and you're erring on the side of caution, most times you're not going to flush a bird. You're being very cautious. Never deliberately try and flush one. A lot of photographers will do this. Want to get that like iconic flight shot of like an owl like looking down, like looking for its prey. Again, there's 5 billion identical photos, great horned owls, great gray owls, doing this. The world does not need more digital photos of owls doing the exact same thing, and it's just not worth it to harass them. And baiting is fortunately something that happens here in Ontario and across Canada. People will sometimes get toy mice and put them on fishing line to try to stimulate prey so that the owls will fly down. And again, it's to get that sort of hunting shot of the owl in flight with its talons out. And people will even release live mice, like from the pet store. And this is terrible because sometimes they're non-native house mice by the pet store, so they can establish a population. You don't want to introduce non-native species. It also teaches owls to associate humans with food and roadsides with food. So in Alberta in particular, and Saskatchewan, where there's a bit of a cottage industry of like guides going out and releasing mice and toy mice on strings, photographers can get their owl shots. A lot of great gray owls and hawk owls and things like that end up getting hit by cars because of that. So there's other considerations with winter birding as well. There's private property. Don't trespass. Don't go on a farmer's field without permission. Again, it seems pretty obvious. I know it's tempting. We think as birders, we kind of get an exception because hobby is so like wholesome, sweet, and we're going to go look at beautiful animals. It's not that big a deal if I go on this person's lawn, but it really ruins the reputation of birders. And if something interesting shows up at somebody's bird feeder in their backyard, they're not gonna let people come. Road condition. Driving in Ontario in the wintertime can be fun. Make sure you have your winter tires. Look at the weather reports. Don't die because you had to see like a snow bunting, a blizzard, drove into a ditch. Your family doesn't want to hear that story. Wear proper winter clothes. This is something I've bad at in the past. Don't show up with like your Converse or like a fall jacket or whatever if it's -30 outside. Make sure that you have enough food, water to drink, and things like that. We want to be aware also of harassment, safety, and discrimination. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of stories in the Ontario birding community of various forms of harassment, including sexual harassment, violence, discrimination, offensive jokes, and things like that. I know personally, in the 5.5 years that I've been birding, I've heard, racist, misogynistic comments out in the field that have made me uncomfortable. I'm part of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion group for the Ontario Field Ornithologists. And I was part of a group that did a diversity survey for the OFO membership. So it's like the big organization representing Ontario birders. And a few months ago, we got back the results, and 98% of birders in Ontario are white. Obviously, that doesn't accurately reflect the makeup of Ontario and how diverse we are. Really have to stop and think about what are the barriers in the culture of the hobby that prevent people of color, prevent queer and trans people, prevent women, prevent people with disabilities from participating. I've been involved in a lot of initiatives to try and make birding more accessible for queer and trans people as a queer and trans person myself. And so far it's been wonderful. We've had Pride-month walks and virtual meetups. It's been wonderful to meet people like me to form that community. But yeah, something to be conscious of. And if you see people behaving in an uncomfortable way or inappropriate way, take the steps to call them out on it and make sure the people you're with are safe. The one nice thing about winter birding as well is that there's no ticks. If it's 0 degrees Celsius, ticks are not active. This spring, I got my first black-legged tick embedded in me, and it was not fun. I didn't get Lyme disease, though, which is nice. So there are Christmas bird counts that take place all over North America and all over the world, and it's the longest-running community science program. It's been going on since 1900. It was developed to replace a tradition of shooting competitions where Victorian men would go out and see how many birds they could shoot on Christmas Day. If the Victorians were good at one thing, it was finding creative ways to kill animals and get joy out of it. But luckily, some early conservationists was like, we can count birds instead. This is actually an excellent source of information about how bird populations have changed over time. And conservationists and ornithologists today, looking at how bird populations have changed, are able to look at Christmas bird count data going back over 100 years and see, wow, back in the 80s and 70s, people were seeing hundreds of evening grosbeaks at their feeders, and now they aren't. I wonder what happened. And so that data is invaluable. It's a great way to see birds. It's a great way to learn about birds, meet bird lovers, get involved with local naturalist clubs. For me, I've been doing it for so many years now that it's just kind of a ubiquitous part of the holiday season, like watching the Charlie Brown Christmas special or the Muppet Family Christmas, you have to go out in the snow all day and count every pigeon that you see. If you don't want to go out in the snow all day and count every pigeon that you see, you can stay home and do a feeder watch, which is where you count all the birds at your feeder. Oftentimes, though, at the Christmas bird count, there'll be some kind of buffet or party at the end where everybody shares the cool birds they saw, and you can be real nerdy. There's lots of other great community science projects, though. There's often winter waterfowl counts, particularly around Hamilton and Lake Ontario. Right now, we're in the middle of the 3rd Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas, which is something that Eileen is heavily involved with. And that's when you go out and try to record evidence for breeding birds. You know, if you see a bird in a nest, that's confirmed breeding. And if you hear a bird singing, you know, that's a different evidence code. And again, it's one of these long running projects that's been going on since the 80s, where they're trying to track the changes in bird populations and distributions over time. So it's really valuable for scientists. There's also hawk watches, take place in the fall and in the spring. And then you can use apps like iNaturalist and eBird to keep track of the birds and the other wildlife that you're observing. And similarly, scientists are able to look at those observations and use that data, and it's extremely valuable for them. So I encourage everyone to get involved with community science programs. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways we can help birds, because there's always more we can do. The biggest one is to keep your cat indoors. According to some estimates, cats kill over 1 billion birds in the United States and Canada every year. They are statistically the #1 killer of birds. And they kill a lot of other wildlife too, you know, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, insects. Keep them inside. It's simple, easy, it's safer for the cat. A coyote won't eat them. If you go to conservation areas and beaches and parks, keep your dog on a leash, especially if it says keep your dog on a leash. It drives me wild when I go to Hyde Park and there's people with their dogs off leash in areas where it says have your dog on a leash right next to the off leash dog park. There's an off leash dog park for a reason. Dogs can scare birds. I know there's they kill birds too. Like there's a story out in Peterborough a few years ago of a woodcock getting eaten by somebody's pet dog out on the trail by where my family lives. They spread the seeds of invasive plants and things like that, and they pack down the soil so plants can't grow as well. It's a huge issue. But people have a real sense of entitlement around their dogs being able to be their children and do whatever they want all the time. Use bird-safe window treatments. Maybe you've seen newer buildings that have those little dots on the windows. That's to make sure that birds don't fly into them. Those work a lot better than the old like hawk silhouettes that you sometimes see. Those ones aren't very effective. Studies found time and time again. So get those little treatments where it's like the 2 dots that are within 2 inches of each other. There's other things you can do too, like have the streamers, almost like bead curtains, string, and some people like draw with like chalk markers or soap on the windows during migration in the fall and spring, and then wash it off. Sustainable agriculture, that's a big one. Shade-grown coffee. A lot of our birds, like we mentioned earlier, they'll migrate to South and Central America, and having those coffee plantations grown in the shade of trees is much better habitat for them. Buying organics, buying local. Climate change is a huge threat to birds. A lot of species of birds that are insectivores, things like whippoorwills, nighthawks, swift swallows are in big decline because of the decline of insect populations, and a lot of that has to do with widespread pesticide use. I will say though that farmers are some of the best allies that wildlife has. Sometimes there's this narrative that agriculture is bad for wildlife, but I think that's completely unfair. There's a lot of amazing stories of farmers making changes to help support birds. Southern Ontario, a lot of farmers have changed the scheduling of when they mow their hay so that grassland nesting birds like eastern meadowlarks and bobolinks can safely fledge. Some of the farmers will lease parts of their land to conservation organizations for part of the year, where they'll plant hedgerows or prairie strips and do habitat restoration work. Farmers are a huge part of population recovery for an endangered bird in the US and California called the tricolor blackbird. And of course, the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust partners with farmers all the time with restrictive covenants and conservation easements that allow them to stay and live on their property and keep it in their family and keep farming and keep maintaining their livelihood, but also maintain it as habitat for birds. So yeah, farmers are real wildlife heroes. There's lots of landscaping choices we can make too. Putting native plants in your backyard supports all kinds of wonderful wildlife. There's a famous statistic that a native oak tree in North America can support 4,000 or more different species of insects and other animals versus non-native trees, which can support something like 12. Having things like brush piles, not using pesticides, are all good choices you can make. You support conservation organizations. There's a really great one I've heard of called the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust. You could definitely use your money. So go to their website and donate. Um, Volunteer. Yeah, we take volunteers too at the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust, and just about every conservation organization and like organization does as well. You can support politicians who believe in climate change. Develop a relationship with nature. I think we really ultimately we protect the things that we care about. Um, and so if you go outside and you learn the names of trees and the wildflowers, and the birds, spend time um, developing that, I think you're much more likely to care. And it's one of the most wonderful experiences to be a naturalist and to always be learning. It's like understanding a second language to be able to go to a park in the city and say, oh, this is Dutchman's breeches, um, Irish cranberry, and that was a yellow warbler singing. A totally different way of engaging the environment. Always learning new stuff. Nobody's an expert in everything. And then, as I mentioned earlier, making sure that we keep conservation and outdoor spaces inclusive, making sure that all sorts of people feel welcome. People of color, women, people with disabilities, queer and trans people, newcomers. We want to make sure that as many people and as many perspectives can participate as possible. And ultimately, that helps the birds. If there's huge demographics of people that don't feel represented in these spaces, then it's going to affect how much they can participate. So that's my presentation for today. I'm going to move out of screen sharing, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask.
All right, great job. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thanks.
You recovered from the disastrous start. So we had a couple of comments from Chris and Philippa about thanks for sharing your knowledge. And we do have a question from Karen. Is it true we should only put birdseed out in winter? I've heard we shouldn't feed the birds in the summer as they need to forage for their own food.
Good question. I get this one a lot as well when I'm talking about birds. It's okay to leave birdseed out in the summertime, but birds really depend on it more in the wintertime when there's fewer food sources. A lot of songbird species in North America are heavily subsidized with bird feeders, and when there's not as much food around in the winter, they really depend on it. If you live like up north, when there's like black bears, it's a problem in the summertime, but in this part of the world, like around the Oak Ridges Marine, like it's as much of an issue. Obviously things like raccoons and stuff like that, skunks get in your backyard. But yeah, it's not a problem to have it out in the summer, but winter is when it really counts.
Okay. We have another question. Where'd it go? Regarding the brown-headed cowbird, a pair has taken over our Phoebe nest for 2 years now.
Oh yeah, brown-headed cowbirds are really interesting. They're a member of the blackbird family, so they're related to things like grackles, meadowlarks, and orioles, and they actually evolved out west to follow herds of bison, and because they eat the insects that the bison kicks up when the massive herds that historically existed with millions of bison, and so they're able to eat all the field insects like crickets. But it means that they're always on the move, and so they couldn't make their own nests. They evolved to lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. And what's interesting is the European colonizers modified the habitat a lot and cleared a lot of forests. There was a lot more open country, so they're actually able to spread and move to the eastern part of the continent where they didn't previously exist, as well as the extermination of the bison. Played a part in that as well. There's a lot of birds in the eastern part of North America that didn't evolve alongside the brown-headed cowbird. So they don't have the understanding that when that big egg shows up in their nest that it belongs to another bird and should get rid of it. Baby brown-headed cowbirds a lot of the time will kick out the young of other bird species out of the nest, like they'll physically remove them, or they're bigger than like a warbler baby, so they will just they'll demand so much food from the parent. I know a few years ago in Hyde Park in Toronto, I saw a brown-headed cowbird juvenile, which is like the size of a red-winged blackbird or a little bit bigger, begging and to its parent, which was a blue-gray gnatcatcher, which is only a little bit bigger than a hummingbird. Like they're one of the tiniest birds in North America, but because of the way that a lot of songbirds' brains work and the way that they'll just register the baby cowbird as their own baby and they'll feed it and take care of it. So it's yeah, it's a little grim, but that's their evolutionary strategy.
Okay. So another question is how to get involved with the Christmas bird count.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So if you search like your area and Christmas bird count on Google, it'll probably come up. A lot of them are run through like local naturalist clubs, and it's a great way to get involved. It was kind of my gateway into the Peterborough Field Naturalists out in Peterborough when I was first learning about birds, and I met a lot of great people through there. I know in Toronto it's run through the TOC, the Toronto Ornithological Club. But yeah, if you just search for your area, there's lots of regional coordinators and people who you can email, and I'll happy to get you involved.
And Birds Canada is another place where you can look up and contact. It's got a map, and you explain your location. If you're in York region, you can always just email myself at landtrust@oakridgesmoraine.org, and I can help you if you can't find it online. Okay, and another question from Karen. Hi, Karen. Could you address offering water in the winter too? Some people use a heater to keep the bird bath open for birds to drink. Is this a problem if birds actually bathe in freezing temperatures? I've heard different opinions on that matter.
Yeah, I haven't heard as much about this. Yeah, I think if it's heated, as long as it's not freezing over, like birds do appreciate like having the opportunity to like wash themselves. The species do that. Yeah, I don't think it's harmful. I haven't heard that.
I will speak from experience. Make sure they have an escape route. I just had an open pond, and I sadly found a cardinal in the spring. So I've done escape routes so that if they get caught in the water, they still have a way out for climbing. They don't have to just fly out. So that's my experience. Yeah, just make sure the water's clean if you can. All right, I'll just go back to the chat and make sure. Are cowbirds a protected species?
That's an interesting question. So under Canadian law, we have the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which protects most migratory birds, but there are exceptions in Canadian and American law for blackbirds because they're considered agricultural pests. So farmers legally can shoot brown-headed cowbirds, grackles, and red-winged blackbirds. You can't. So you can't go in your backyard with a BB gun and take them out that way. I know some people, there's sort of a debate back and forth about whether it's okay to remove cowbird eggs from nests of other bird species. I think the consensus amongst ornithologists is that you should leave it because cowbirds have the right to exist too, even if it's a little bit grim by our human standards. The one exception is I know when they were first doing the really intensive restoration work for Kirtland's warbler in Michigan. Kirtland's warbler is only found around the Great Lakes region. They didn't evolve around brown-headed cowbirds, so they don't recognize the eggs. So a lot of their nests are vulnerable to them. So back in the 70s and 80s, they would actually kill the brown-headed cowbirds out in those jack pine forests in Michigan. But yeah.
I heard recently that their populations are actually starting to show decline. So
yeah.
Another reason to let nature take its course with them. All right, I think that's it for questions. Just want to make sure I got everything. I think I've caught everything. So thank you so much, Maxwell, and thank you to everybody for coming. We are recording this, so we will have that available. And thank you for tolerating the technical issues, both with some of the registrations and with the start of the presentation, which is on me. But I hope everybody has a great day. We are doing the hike this Saturday. If you're not signed up already, it'll be one of our private nature reserves. And myself and Maxwell will also be out there helping out. We will have a few extra pairs of binoculars available. And it's even if we don't see any birds, it's a great day out in nature. So we might see some of you out there. And we will be posting more webinars coming up soon for the Oak Ridges Moraine, so more opportunities to learn about nature. And hopefully we'll see you guys out there, either online or in person. So thank you, everybody, and have a fantastic night and good birding.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Maxwell.
Thanks.
Good job.